January 2018. In the article I wrote for the January 2018 issue of this newsletter, I went back to the beginning of the biblical account of God's plan of salvation, and recounted the things you need to know and believe if you intend to be one of those who participate in the resurrection of the righteous at the end of the age. I told you the story begins immediately after Adam and Eve admitted their sin to God. At that time, He gave them the promise that they could be created in His image and likeness, if they would merely believe the promise and hand it down as an inheritance, so that others would have opportunity to believe it as well. I also reviewed the things I explained in The Inheritance of the Believer, Volume 1. I told you the genealogies in Genesis chapters 5 through 11 are an account of how Abraham came to be the heir of the promise, and the remainder of the book of Genesis tells us how Abraham handed down the promise to his son Isaac, and Isaac handed down the promise to his son Jacob. I concluded the article in the January 2018 issue with the following bibliographic information. In Transliteration is Not Translation, The Voice of Elijah, July 2008, page 2, I give the following summary of The Inheritance of the Believer, Volume 1. In The Inheritance of the Believer, Volume 1, I explained what you need to know about the promise, the inheritance of the promise, and the inheritance of what was promised. I explained that the promise is nothing more than the teaching that explains how God fulfilled the promise He made to Adam and Eve. He promised them He would take a man and create the man in His own image and likeness. I told you God did that with the man Jesus Christ. But I reminded you that God also promised He would create other descendants of Adam, both male and female, in His own image and likeness. I explained that those are the true believers who will be resurrected in the image and likeness of God, because they believed the promise He made. Then I told you how you can become one of those who will be created in the image and likeness of God, at the end of the age. I said all you have to do is believe the promise when you have opportunity to hear it. When you believe the promise, you thereby inherit the promise as an heir of Jesus Christ, and you become a member of the body of Jesus Christ, the one who is corporate Israel. In The Living Word of God Will Never Change, The Voice of Elijah Update, December 2005, pages 10 through 12, I point out how God made various promises to different individuals down through history, and how those promises merely reflect some facet of the original promise that God made to Adam. I distinguish between the various facets of the promise, the blessing of Abraham, the promise of the Spirit, and the promise of resurrection in the image and likeness of God. In If Time Were Not a Moving Thing, The Voice of Elijah Update, June 2006, pages 14 through 16, I focus on the promise God made to Abraham about his seed being like the stars. In A Simple Definition, Inheritance Means Somebody Died, The Voice of Elijah, July 2007, pages 3 through 5, I explain that the promise began as prophecy in an oral tradition, that was handed down from one generation to the next as an inheritance, and it gradually became a recounting of history as more and more facets of the promise were fulfilled. I also explained that the vehicle by which the promise was handed down was an oral blessing that was received by belief. In Irenaeus Knew All About the Inheritance of the Promise, The Voice of Elijah Update, March 2008, pages 6 and 7, I point out that Irenaeus' comment on how the inheritance was thrown open to both Jews and Gentiles after the death of Christ, is actually focused on the fact that those who are resurrected in the image and likeness of God at the end of the sixth day of creation, will live on the earth during the seventh day of rest. In Two Perspectives, One Truth, The Voice of Elijah Update, August 2010, pages 6 through 9, I summarize the things I explained about Irenaeus' understanding of the promise in the May and June issues of that newsletter. My purpose was to show that both Paul and Irenaeus understood the continuity that exists between the Old Testament and the New, resides in the promise of God. In Not All Israel is Israel, I explain other things one needs to know about the promise. I said God confirmed the promise to the patriarchs in the same way each time because it was the same promise. I also told you the promise and the blessing can be used interchangeably, because the promise was handed down as an oral blessing.